73 Yards is easily the episode I was most excited for this year. But did it live up to my hype? Let's find out. The episode starts with a very interesting twist, as there is no title sequence. Instead, the establishing shot of the TARDIS materialising fades in as the cast and crew's names are displayed over the top. I thought this was a really exciting change for the episode and solidified my predictions that this would be an absolute banger of an episode. However, I think upon reflection, it is a bad omen for things to come. I cut this mini debate out of one of my previous videos, but the 45-minute runtime for Doctor Who just does not seem to be cutting it, and neither does an 8-episode season. To compensate for this, I saw someone suggest that Doctor Who could follow a formula similar to that of Black Mirror, where every episode can range from 30 to 90 minutes depending on the story being told. I'm not sure how that works for scheduling on the BBC and stuff, but goddamn would that really allow certain stories to breathe. I've said since I first watched this episode that it really could have been a two-parter. It feels like the episode accomplishes so much but yet so little. I remember watching it and saying something like, how has all of this been done in 45 minutes? Plot-wise, the episode is marvellous. It never slows down, always keeps you guessing, and most importantly makes sure you're constantly entertained. It shifts genre every few scenes, making you scared or paranoid or laugh and cry, and never feels disjointed or like it's giving you whiplash. But character-wise, I'll address this later though, because I'm really dying to talk about the plot of this week's adventure. So, there's been a lot of confusion about what actually happens in 73 Yards, and I'm not surprised. I had a revolving door of questions circling around my brain after finishing the episode, and it was one of my biggest problems with it as a whole. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of ambiguous storytelling, but it's not satisfying to just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and hope something sticks, because it's been my impression that most of the explanations I've seen by fans are headcanon or speculation. And no, I don't necessarily need everything explaining to me. I have no issue with the circle not being explained, or even the woman for example. It's been established for a while now that supernatural elements are creeping into the Doctor Who universe, so I have enough explanation already to go, it's some paranormal force from the edge of the universe. That's fine to me. Where the ambiguity fails is when Russell T Davies tries to loop the story, making Ruby the woman by the end of the story just kinda shits on everything else, doesn't it? I was in love with the somewhat Lovecraftian approach to the story. I didn't want to know what the woman was saying to people because it left me thinking she can only be saying the most terrifying or cruel or accusational thing imaginable, something far too deep for a human to actually come up with. But when Ruby loops back and presumably becomes the woman, I now really want to know what she was saying the whole time, because how could Ruby herself drive everyone away? Unfortunately, all of this baffling mystery led me to actually scour the internet for answers, something which I don't normally do. I love coming up with my own interpretations on media, but I worried that I couldn't discuss this episode without some sort of concrete understanding. I've compiled a few theories and references, and this is the best I've come up with. Hopefully it helps to explain this story to those equally lost as myself. There's a lot of mention about liminal spaces in this episode, specifically in reference to the cliff tops where the woman is unleashed. It is said that a liminal space is where the rules are suspended, allowing something like witchcraft or a curse to bleed into the world, much like the Doctor invoking superstition at the edge of the universe in Wild Blue Yonder. The act of defacing the fairy circle within this liminal space puts Ruby into a state of permanent liminality. As we see from the montage of her life passing by, she is unable to commit to anything, specifically relationships. She's afraid to commit for fear that those closest to her will abandon her, but she's afraid to be alone because, well, aren't we all? So she's stuck in this middle ground where she's not focusing on her relationships but not focusing on how to fix her problem either. She is only able to resolve the curse when she commits to one or the other, which she eventually does, but we'll get onto that. So yes, it seems evident that the whole ordeal in this episode is a curse, but it appears it wasn't just Ruby that was cursed. Trace back the episode and it was actually the Doctor who broke the circle. In Celtic folklore, it is said that fairies would kidnap people and leave a changeling in their place. It appears to me that the result of the Doctor breaking the circle was his kidnapping, leaving in his place Mad Jack, who would manifest within the body of Roger ap Gwilliam, the last person the Doctor actually mentioned before disappearing. However, Ruby still defaced the circle by reading aloud its spells or binds, meaning that she was cursed with a lesser punishment to live out her worst fear, abandonment. Anyone that helps Ruby or is good to Ruby is taken away from her. Josh is the only one in the pub who is completely kind to her, and he is driven away. Her mother is driven away, Kate Stewart is driven away, etc. But upon Ruby using her own curse to banish Mad Jack yet again, she is rewarded as she is taken back to the moment that the curse was placed and given a chance to prevent it. So potentially, Ruby was not the woman all along and instead possessed the body of the woman when she was taken back. I've also seen a theory that she was the woman the whole time, and when Ruby dies in the hospital bed, she is taken back through her own timeline until she reaches the day she arrived in Wales with the Doctor, allowing her to undo the events of the episode. Either way, this appears to be a one and done loop, with Kate Stewart furthering my belief of this, saying,
"I think this timeline might be suspended along your event,"
indicating that this is some sort of parallel universe created by the inciting incident, much like in the episode Turn Left. I'd prefer to believe that Ruby was rewarded by the woman and taken back to the beginning to redo her life, as this leaves the more Lovecraftian elements I mentioned earlier feeling more natural to the story. But Ruby being the woman the entire time feeds into this anxiety and insecurity of driving everyone you love away yourself and ending up abandoned. It also makes more sense of the whole "I've been to Wales 3 times" at the end as opposed to the original 2 at the beginning, so I don't know, take your pick. And yes, there is some explanation here that actually comes from the pub folk, and people online have said that that can't work given they were only joking, feeding Ruby some childish superstition. Which is where I refer you to Wild Blue Yonder, where the Doctor says,
"It's a superstition, and it's true. 2 things at once."
It's clear that this is all a result of the fantasy direction that Russell T Davies is taking the show. So trying to think about it from a sci-fi lens just isn't going to work. Which I admit is a hard pill to swallow, given that us Whovians have been conditioned to follow the show from said lens for 60 years now. But hey, Doctor Who is about change, even if I don't like this particular change. Hopefully that clears some stuff up. Unfortunately, this is all speculation, and unless a future episode clears this up, and if it does I will bite my words, we won't get a proper conclusion to this story. And again, some ambiguity is good in storytelling, but leaving the entire purpose of your story without any kind of definition just feels a bit lazy to me. With the mystery somewhat cleared up, some other things I liked about the plot were the pub scene. It was oozing with atmosphere and tension, and where I thought the whole episode would be spent. I'm kinda glad it wasn't in retrospect, but it was an absolutely perfect location for a horror-based episode of Doctor Who. Though I will say, the unnecessary cruelty from the characters felt a little bit off. Then again, I've heard that the rural Welsh are not fans of the English, so it could just be that. Russell would know better than me after all. Ruby returning home only to have her mother turn on her so sharply was excellent and truly emotionally brutal. The line, "even your own mother didn't want you," was crushing, even if it's somewhat reminiscent of a playground insult, perhaps emblematic of the childlike fairies at work here. Although I was excited to see Carla, Cherry and Mrs. Flood return, purely because they've had practically nothing to do following the Christmas episode. And to see them get rushed past, even repeating the Carla forgets about Ruby and gets miserable story beat, was a little underwhelming, to be honest. The return of Unit was fantastic and really solidified the woman as a terrifying and unexplainable threat, although the line about the silver and salt confused me somewhat, as it's supposed to work against witchcraft and Ruby is literally cursed in this episode. So how does it not work? Is salt preventative, or is this all just a big superstition that the Doctor created? I'm sure this will be cleared up though, so I won't bark too much. The montage was awesome and a great piece of visual storytelling. Seeing Ruby's age go up on the birthday cards was truly some awesome filmmaking and something to credit Dylan Holmes-Williams, this week's director, for, assuming that it was his call. Especially because this era has done a lot of tell don't show so far. I will say though that I wasn't entirely convinced by Ruby's aged look. And no, Twitter, I was not expecting her to look like Matt Smith in his final episode or anything, but just a wig and glasses don't stop Millie Gibson from looking 18. Some laugh lines at least would have been nice. But yeah, everything with Roger Ap Gwilliam was awesome. It is a bit tiresome to see Russell T Davies handle the evil Conservative Prime Minister again, seeing as he's done it like 4 or 5 times in Doctor Who now, but it still worked very well for me. The threat and terror of nuclear war is something that's very prevalent in the real world again, and seeing as this episode feels particularly targeted to adolescents and young adults, with relatable fears and anxieties about being lonely and missing out on personal relationships, it feels only right that the episode would comment on yet another fear I'm sure most people my age have. Hell, even from a story perspective, this works. Assuming that the old woman in the pub was referring to Mad Jack when she cites the spiteful one, having the Prime Minister be totally obsessed with nuclear war, having him be as duplicitous as he is, and even hinting that he sexually abuses his staff? Yeah, sometimes a villain can just be spiteful with no real incentive other than complete power. It works wonders in creating a truly hateable antagonist who doesn't really get much screen time too. And having Marty say he's a monster works to establish that he's not only needlessly cruel, a metaphorical monster, but also because he's the literal monster of the week, Mad Jack, a great double meaning there from Russell. And of course, Ruby using the woman to banish the Prime Minister was immensely satisfying. What a triumphant scene that solidifies how competent and brilliant Ruby is as a character. Although, speaking about Ruby's character, I was under the assumption that with this being a Dr. Light story, a lot of her character development, or at least a deep dive into her character, would be in this episode. But it turns out that no, that didn't happen. Before I delve into this, I want to say I'm overly positive on the episode. I liked it a lot. The premise was fantastic, it's definitely one of the more unique stories in Doctor Who history, jumping around genres and storylines and time periods like it's a sequel to Years and Years, and it genuinely had me guessing what's gonna happen, how is all of this gonna be fixed, much like last week's episode too. I also think the episode looks stunning. This is easily some of the best camera work we've ever had for Doctor Who, and the performances from everyone involved, but primarily Millie Gibson, are just breathtaking. I really want to point out how impressive Millie's performance is though, as if I'm not mistaken, this is the first thing she filmed for the show, as Ncuti Gatwa was busy working on Sex Education Series 4, and for a first time on set, she absolutely kills it. But as Council of Geeks so rightfully pointed out in their recent review of the episode, it's much easier to critique something instead of praising it. You can say this was awesome and that was awesome, but there's not much to pick apart after that, but critiquing something, you can highlight where it went wrong, how it could have improved, how you would have improved it, how X could be substituted for Y, etc. So with that being said, I must say that Ruby is an incredibly average character. She's reminding me a lot of Clara from Series 7. She's likeable, she gets on very well with the Doctor, she's very intelligent, she's very capable, but why is she all of these things? I hate to keep comparing the new era to the first of the revival, but bear with me. Rose in Series 1, why is she likeable? Because she looks out for the little guy. Growing up in a working class environment with a single mother on a council estate, she has empathy for people who get left behind and forgotten about and trodden on. Why does she get on well with the Doctor? Because she takes time to establish a comfortable relationship with him over their travels. And even that falls apart every now and then, like in Dalek and Father's Day, which ultimately makes their bond stronger. Ruby has no background detail to establish any of her traits. And look, to be honest, characters don't necessarily need background details to make them who they are. So I was hoping that if Ruby's character traits weren't going to be justified, then they'd at least be built on, but sadly not. I learned nothing new about Ruby in this episode, except for a fear of abandonment, but her fear of abandonment doesn't quite land because we've not seen any hints of this before. She's very content with her newfound family, and never once does she express before this episode that she's scared they'll leave her eventually. She doesn't even get a quick line to the Doctor in any previous episodes where she says, "Promise you won't just leave me behind in some distant time or place." And while it's nice that she gets given a fear of abandonment here, it certainly adds something to her character that was lacking. It would have hit so much harder if it was previously established, and I have a really strong fear that this aspect of her character won't be brought up again. Even as she ages and eventually dies all alone, I don't feel emotional because I'm not drawn into this character. She barely extends beyond a quirky modern day girl. And while I wouldn't exactly describe her as a bad character, she is certainly a lacking one. I just thank the Lord that Millie Gibson is able to inject some much needed energy into her, because my god, does she need it. Millie Gibson is absolutely killing it, and I really hope she's given more to do soon. But I doubt it, as this short 8-episode season really isn't allowing for much time to sit still and grow the characters. So, overall, I like 73 Yards. It's confusing and a bit muddled with no clear definition or understanding of its own core aspects, but it's entertaining, a bit spooky, definitely interesting, and super well acted. I'd by no means say it's a bad episode, but I wouldn't exactly call it great either. I'm grateful for what it tries to accomplish, and I think that it ultimately sticks the landing, but it doesn't do so elegantly. I give 73 Yards a slightly hesitant 7 out of 10. Thank you all for watching. I hope you liked the review. Let me know your thoughts on the episode in the comments below, and if you agree or disagree with anything I've said here. Be sure to subscribe and turn notifications on to stay tuned for next week's review of Dot and Bubble, and as always, I've been your host, Mr. Greaves. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.